Welcome to Spotlight Matthew for today as we turn to Matthew chapter 16 verses 21 through 28. And to set the context for this, we saw in two devotions ago that it seemed that the disciples really didn't get it. Jesus was talking about the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They thought he was talking about the fact that they didn't bring bread on the boat. And he said to them, you saw me feed the 5,000. You saw me feed the 4,000. I'm not worried about whether we have bread to eat. Don't you get what I'm laying down, what I'm trying to say to you here? And it was a bit exasperating because they didn't seem to get it. And then we turned to our last devotional study, which had the incredible confession of Peter. Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the one of God. You are the very Son of our Heavenly Father. You're the Son of God and God the Son." And Jesus is ecstatic because it seems that they get it. He says, "Peter, flesh and blood, human thinking has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." It seems like you got it. But immediately then on the heels of that, we turn to our passage for today, for it is directly after this great confession that Jesus begins to tell his disciples that the road of the Messiah will not be the road to glory and majesty and power, but it will be a road that leads him to suffering and to death on the cross. And that's where we pick up today's passage, chapter 16, verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day rise again. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men." So what's going on here? Jesus announces that indeed the path of messiahship is going to be the path that leads him to Jerusalem. And there he will be betrayed to the religious leaders, the really religious people who have been gunning for him, remember, all the way back to Matthew chapter 12, verse 14. And they indeed will prevail, and Jesus will suffer many things at their hands and be executed. And then he'll rise on the third day. The disciples understood the first part of that, but they probably didn't have conceptual framework to understand what this rising on the third day could mean. What Jesus is actually doing here is making explicit what he had said implicitly when he had spoken of the sign of Jonah, that little parable that he was giving to the religious leaders about what his ultimate sign would be. Now he's coming explicitly. You see, the sign of Jonah concealed it. Remember, parables conceal from some. And now Jesus is revealing to the disciples what was meant by that. That indeed this is the path that will be taken, the sign of Jonah that will be fulfilled. And Peter does not have categories for this because Peter wants the Messiah to be the one who comes into Jerusalem, dethrones and exits out the horrible Roman occupiers and oppressors. He wants Jesus to come and be great David's greater son, to sit upon the throne in majesty as the monarch of Israel, and Israel as the foremost of all countries throughout the world. That's the messianic vision that Peter has in mind. And what Jesus has just said is totally antithetical to that which Peter desires. And Jesus must harshly turn to him and say, you know, that vision that you have, that anticipation, that desire perhaps you have under the table to be second in command underneath me, as I just complimented you about your confession, all that is garbage. And to go that route is to buy into the lie of the devil and to think in the way that mere men, after men's desires and men's goals and visions and expectations, would have this happen. And take in mind with this is Peter, who has just recognized that Jesus is the Messiah of God, rebuking the Messiah of God, that Jesus is the Son of God, and he is taking to task the very Son of God. Wow. I think it's no mistake that we have in these two episodes the flip sides of church leadership. We mentioned in the last devotional study that the church needs apostolic succession in its teaching, the New Testament documents, but it also needs apostolic succession in godly leadership. Not the Pope necessarily, but godly leadership. And the church rises and falls with biblical teaching and godly leadership. And we saw how Peter could be that godly leader and make the good confession. He could step forward on behalf of the disciples. He could have a word from God, from heaven, that indeed could be the lifeblood for the future of God's church. And yet we turn around in this next episode, and Peter is equally capable as a church leader, as a future leader, to listen to the way of the world and to play into the hands of the devil himself. And friends, when church leaders do that, it gives the opportunity for the gates of hell to prevail against the church, unlike what happened in the previous episode. And I simply want us to realize that if indeed godly leaders can build up the church as mentioned in the last devotional, it is ungodly leaders who are not listening to the way of Jesus Christ who tear it down. And sometimes it can be the very same person, because Peter here is hearing a word from God that he doesn't want to hear. And therefore I'm sure he thinks he's taking Jesus aside to save Jesus from himself. Most people who lead the church astray are sincerely convicted that they are right about the direction that they would lead the church. But they aren't. And they do great harm because they start listening to the things of men and start operating the church in the way of the world, or sometimes even worse. And so we find this juxtaposition, this great contrast that comes even in Peter himself from one moment to the very next moment. So that being said, we indeed in the church today have to get to the heart of the matter. What protects the church leaders? What protects the church so that its leadership will not fall off into embracing the way of the world and play to the devil's hand? Well, that's the rest of our passage, and I simply read it to us for today. Jesus then goes on to say, do you want to know the cure to what Peter has just done? Ungodly leadership, misguided leadership. It starts with this. Verse 24, Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever will lose his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world but forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man gain in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each one according to what he has done. And truly I say, there are some standing here who will not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming into his kingdom. What is the antidote to what Peter has done, to Peter listening to the way of the world and the way of spiritual darkness? Well, it's for leaders to take up their cross and follow Jesus. It's for leaders to live a life that denies themselves for the sake of Jesus. It is those who indeed will not forfeit their souls, or the souls of their sheep, the souls of those who are in their church, for earthly gain or earthly prestige and kingdom building. It's those who will set aside the kingdom of self or the kingdom of the church for the kingdom of Jesus. It's those who indeed will value the soul and value the heart over the things of this world that would say that success has been accomplished. Those are the things that Jesus says he is looking for. And when Judgment Day comes, those are the things for which Jesus will repay each one. So friends, let us remember this word of Jesus. Let us remember that indeed he calls us to set ourselves aside so that he may be Lord of his church, even when he calls his church to follow him in the way of the cross. That is Spotlight Matthew for today. As always, spotlightgoodnews.com. like us on Facebook, and share us with others, and we will talk to you next time.